Ingo Swann was one of the most well-known psychics to emerge from the CIA's psychic spy program known as Project Stargate. Some people called him the man with the X-ray eyes because of his ability to astrally project his consciousness and see distant or hidden objects, events, and places. In 2006, the CIA declassified thousands of pages of documents about Project Stargate. Within those pages, you can find many stories of government psychics who were able to spy on foreign countries, locate hostages, and even prevent assassination attempts. But although Ingo Swann's name turns up in a lot of those declassified documents, there is one story in particular that didn't come out until 1998, when Swann released his book, Penetration. In that book, Swann claims that he was once hired by some shadowy U.S. intelligence organization to remote view the dark side of the moon. That was where he saw alien beings constructing a secret base inside a crater. Aliens who were not friendly to us humans. In 1972, a classified report was released to U.S. intelligence that the Soviet Union had begun pouring millions of dollars into a program to research psychic abilities. Things that include ESP, telekinesis, and mind reading. Among the evidence leaked to the CIA was a film of a Russian housewife named Nina Kulagina, who reportedly had the ability to move objects with her mind. In this video, you can see Kulagina moving small objects inside a sealed box without touching them. The most shocking part of this video, though, came when Kulagina was able to stop a frog's heart from beating just by staring at it. This spurred the CIA, the U.S. Army, and the Defense Intelligence Agency to develop their own psychic spy program that was spread out across a number of top-secret facilities across the country. Over the years that followed, these programs went through an assortment of code names, including Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Sunstreak, Scanate, and most famously, Project Stargate. To some people, the U.S. psychic spy program was just another government boondoggle. Officially, the Stargate program was terminated in 1995 after a CIA report stated that the program never produced any useful results. Only that's not quite true. Some of the psychics who were part of the program made some shockingly accurate predictions. In this episode, I really want to focus on one psychic in particular, Ingo Swann, one of the biggest stars to come out of the Stargate program. In fact, he is the person credited with coining the term remote viewing. Although Ingo Swann's remote viewing abilities were considered remarkable, he didn't consider them to be unique to just him. He believed you could teach anyone to remote view, and he did. Although the CIA's psychic espionage program pulled in a number of people who claimed to already possess psychic abilities, it also trained a number of military officers who never had any psychic visions and remote viewing before then. Ingo Swann was one of the primary instructors of this process, which came to be known as Scanate. On the surface, Ingo Swann was not the sort of person you would imagine working for the U.S. intelligence community. He was an artist and a free thinker. He was born in Telluride, Colorado in 1933, and he claimed to have had psychic abilities ever since he was a child. He said that he had his first out-of-body experience when he was just 3 years old following a tonsillectomy operation. Swann claimed that psychic abilities ran in the family. His grandmother also possessed the second sight. Growing up, Swann's family encouraged him to develop his gifts both as a psychic and as an artist. During the 1950s, Swann enlisted in the Army and served 3 years in Korea. But after he left the Army, he moved to New York to pursue an art career. In New York, Swann met a wealthy and well-known artist named Buell Mullen. She had painted portraits of a number of world leaders, including President Eisenhower. She was also fascinated with the idea of psychic powers, so she and Swann naturally hit it off. Buell introduced Swann to many of her other well-connected friends, including a man named Cleve Baxter. Cleve was an interrogation specialist for the CIA. Baxter is also well known for his theory of primary perception, in which he claimed that plants feel pain and have ESP. Baxter and Ingo Swann quickly became friends. Swann even asked Baxter if he could visit the man's lab sometime to see if he could try to communicate psychically with the plants. It was also around the same time that Ingo Swann volunteered to become a guinea pig for the American Society for Psychical Research. The ASPR was the oldest psychic research organization in the United States, and one of the most respected. Swann disliked working at the ASPR. He thought the researchers were all small-minded and snobbish, but he needed the money they paid him for participating in their experiments. Some of the early out-of-body experience tests that the ASPR performed on Swann involved placing objects in a box on a high shelf close to a 14-foot ceiling over Swann's head where he couldn't see. Swann sat alone in the test chamber with wires from electrodes fastened to his skull. He was given a clipboard to use for sketching. In many cases, Swann was able to accurately draw these objects. There was even one time during one of these tests when he told the researcher that he couldn't see anything inside the box. The researcher was naturally disappointed, to which Swann clarified by saying no, he literally couldn't see because the light bulb inside the box was burned out. When the researcher looked inside the box, he realized Swann was correct. Swann proved so successful in the ASPR's experiments that Cleve Baxter put him in touch with Hal Puthoff, a physicist who was conducting related psychic experiments with the Stanford Research Institute in San Francisco. In one of the SRI's early experiments with Ingo Swann, they took him to a lab with a magnetometer in the basement. This was a superconductive shielded device that was used for detecting subatomic particles known as quarks. Hal Puthoff had a theory that psychic abilities were tied to magnetism. So he wanted to see if Swann could use his mental abilities to create a reading on the magnetometer. But when he got there, Swann was upset when he found out that the magnetometer was actually in the basement beneath his feet and he wasn't allowed to see or touch it. At the same time, Swann realized that he was stuck. If he walked out now, everyone would think he was a fraud. He asked if he could try drawing to help him visualize the device. Almost immediately, as Ingo Swann put pen to paper and began to sketch what he was seeing in his mind, the needle on the detector began to jump around. One of the researchers was startled and cried out, which broke Swann's concentration. The needle immediately stopped moving on the device. But just as soon as Swann began drawing again, the needle began to move around once more. Two of the doctoral students were so freaked out by what they witnessed that they ran out of the room. One of them ran face first into a support beam. Hal Puthoff wrote about his findings with Ingo Swann in a report that he sent to various colleagues. A few weeks later, Puthoff received a knock at his door. It was a pair of CIA agents, and they were very interested in Hal Puthoff's research. The CIA offered to fund the SRI's psychic research program, but first they wanted additional proof. A couple of CIA agents pretending to be research scientists decided to test Ingo Swann's abilities for themselves. One of them went outside and captured a brown moth in a box. He brought the sealed box inside, presented it to Swann, and asked him to describe what was inside. Swann said he saw something brown inside, like a leaf, except he added, this thing was moving around. Whatever it was, he realized, it was alive. 2 weeks later, the SRI received a check from the government for $50,000. But this money came with stipulations. Initially, the CIA gave the SRI 8 months to produce some useful results. Hal Puthoff and another physicist from the SRI named Russell Targ decided that the most practical application that their psychics could do would be if they were able to use their mental abilities to spy on locations far away. This was the next logical step after the ceiling tests Swann had been doing previously. Puthoff and Targ called these tests the Outbounder Beacon Experiments. The Outbounders in question were some of the researchers who would drive to a random location and concentrate on it, while Swann would have to sit in a Faraday cage and draw the location on a piece of paper. The results were genuinely surprising. Swann didn't always get things right, but the number of times he did was well above the amount that statistical probabilities said he should have gotten right. The head of the SRI program was a CIA scientist named Kit Green. He became so impressed with Swann's abilities that one day he decided to take the test a step further. Green went out into the hallway and asked the first person he saw to think of a location that meant something special to him, and to not tell anyone. He then went to Hal Puthoff and told him to communicate with Swann and ask him to draw the location the man was thinking about. Swann drew a map to what he said was a top-secret military base. In front of this base was a circular driveway with a flagpole. He said he could see some sort of bunker beyond that. He thought he might be looking at a former Army missile base. But then things got even weirder. A few days earlier, Puthoff and Swann had left the Stanford facility and headed to a nearby Christmas tree lot to pick out a tree for the office. There they met the lot's owner, a man named Pat Price, who came over and shook their hands. He told Puthoff he recognized him from a convention in Los Angeles the year before, and that he'd read a little bit about the experiments he was in charge of in the paper. Price told Puthoff cryptically that if he ever needed help, he could handle anything. Puthoff didn't think anything of it at the time, but then, not long after Ingo Swann drew his map of the purported military base, Puthoff received a phone call. It was Pat Price. He told Green he was psychic too, and to prove it, he had drawn his own map to the very same top-secret military base Ingo Swann had just drawn. This was especially shocking considering Price shouldn't have known anything about the secret experiment they were conducting. Not only that, but Price's maps and description of the base were even more detailed than Ingo Swann's had been. He was able to accurately describe individual offices, and he included tiny details like the coffee cups on desks, the number of file cabinets, employee name placards, and specific names of classified military projects that appeared on file folders. He even knew the name of this top-secret base, which he said was Sugar Grove. Putoff went to Kit Green and told him about the strange phone call from Pat Price he'd just received. Green was so blown away by all this that he immediately went and found his CIA colleague that he'd run into in the hallway earlier to confirm everything. He was dumbfounded when the man told him that everything the two psychics told him was dead wrong. He'd actually been thinking about his getaway cabin in the woods. Only Kit Green couldn't shake just how much detail these two psychics had provided about the exact same location. So that weekend, Green drove out to his colleague's cabin and began looking around. He decided to keep following the road that led past the cabin and just kept driving to see where else it went. He eventually reached a set of metal fences topped with barbed wire. Just beyond that gate was a circular driveway with a flagpole, exactly as the two psychics described. Green had found his way to the front gate of a top-secret military base that even his CIA colleague didn't know was there. It was a former missile base that was currently being used by the National Security Agency. And the base's code name? Sugar Grove. Green wrote up the incident in an official report and turned it in. Then on Monday, he showed up for work and was met by two CIA security officers who had opened up an espionage inquiry into Ingo Swann and Pat Price, and they were demanding answers. It turned out the descriptions the two psychics had given, right down to the names of several classified intelligence operations, were nearly 100% accurate. Eventually, Green was able to convince the CIA officers that Swann and Price couldn't possibly be Soviet spies, but that only led to an even more disturbing conclusion, that these two purported psychics must be the real deal. After that, Pat Price was brought into the program and given his own security clearance. Pat Price is worth an episode of his own, so leave me a comment if you'd like to hear more about him. His story is just as amazing as Ingo Swann's. Let's just say Ingo Swann isn't the only one who had visions about aliens. By April 1973, Ingo Swann was growing a little bored with all the standard remote viewing tests they'd been doing. So he proposed to Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ that they really push his talents by remote viewing somewhere farther away. A lot farther away. Namely, the planet Jupiter. A few years earlier, NASA had sent out the Pioneer 10 and 11 space probes to Jupiter. The first of these probes was scheduled to reach Jupiter and begin sending back images in September 1973. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to see if a remote viewer could provide the same data from our faraway celestial neighbor. Swann didn't like remote viewing anywhere that couldn't be independently confirmed. But if the Pioneer probes sent back data that matched his visions, this would be proof that remote viewing worked. And as it turns out, many of Swann's descriptions of Jupiter did indeed match the information provided by the Pioneer probes. Swann described the planet as having a hydrogen mantle, and that it was surrounded by massive rotating storms. He said there were ice crystals in the atmosphere, and he was even able to describe the color of the clouds. All these things were confirmed by the Pioneer space probes. Now, skeptics would argue that all these things could have been easily guessed by anyone with a reasonable knowledge of astronomy. Astronomers had long known about the violent storms making up Jupiter's atmosphere, as well as the color of the clouds. But then, Ingo Swann came up with one more detail about Jupiter that wasn't known at the time. Swann said that Jupiter had a ring around it, much like Saturn did. Only this ring was a lot smaller and closer to the planet. Neither one of the Pioneer probes detected this, though. The scientists all just assumed Ingo Swann had gotten it wrong. That is until 1979 when Voyager 1 passed by Jupiter, and it saw a ring just like the one Ingo Swann said was there. Ingo Swann was so successful at remote viewing that it wasn't long before some other members of the U.S. intelligence community put him to work. And from here, the story goes from strange to the realm of science fiction. In late February of 1975, Ingo Swann received a phone call from a government official telling him that someone calling himself Mr. Axelrod would be contacting him, and that it was very important that he did whatever the man asked. About a month later, Mr. Axelrod called Swann at 3 a.m., waking him from a sound sleep. Mr. Axelrod told Swann to go to the Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. at noon that same day. He was supposed to stand near the elephant in the center rotunda and wait to be contacted. When Swann asked how he would know what his contact looked like, Mr. Axelrod said, "Don't worry about it. We know what you look like." Swann was curious. All this espionage stuff was exciting. So a few hours later, he took a short flight from LaGuardia Airport to Washington, D.C. He then made his way to the Natural History Museum and waited as instructed. A man in a suit approached him and handed him a card. It said, "Do not speak or ask any questions. This is for your safety as well as ours." The man in the suit was big and fit with close cropped hair. He looked like a Marine. He had a partner with him who looked so much alike that Ingo Swann had a hard time telling them apart. From then on, he began referring to them as the twins. One of the twins led Swann to a car waiting outside. Once Swann got in, one of the twins handed him another card. This one said, "Please do not speak. You may smoke if you want." About 20 minutes later, they arrived at a helipad where a hood was placed over his head. From there, Ingo Swann said he took a flight somewhere, but where exactly they took him, he didn't know. From there, he was led inside a building. He then got on an elevator where he felt as if he were descending deep underground. Once he was out of the elevator, the twins finally removed the hood and allowed him to speak. This is where he met the mysterious Mr. Axelrod. He described Axelrod as a kindly-looking fellow wearing a green jumpsuit. Axelrod seemed to know everything about Swann, including the brand of cigars he smoked. Later on, the two men ate dinner together while Axelrod explained what he wanted. Axelrod told him that the U.S. government wanted to pay Swann for his services as a remote viewer. If he agreed to do so, there were some stipulations he needed to follow. Swann would be required to remain inside the underground facility for however long the experiment went on. He also said he couldn't tell anyone about the work they would be doing for at least 10 years. Swann would be given a comfy bedroom to sleep in, and all his meals and anything else he needed would be provided. For his time and effort, the government would pay Ingo Swann $1,000 a day in cash. That's about $6,000 in today's money. Swann really needed the money, so he eagerly agreed. Axelrod told him they would begin their sessions the following morning. Over dinner, Mr. Axelrod and Ingo Swann talked about how remote viewing actually worked. For reasons that even Swann didn't understand, the remote viewing worked better when he was provided coordinates to follow. This never made sense to Swann since coordinates were arbitrary numbers that were assigned by map makers long ago. But for some reason, it helped focus his psychic visions. The conversation soon turned to the accuracy of Swann's visions about Jupiter. This led to Axelrod revealing that he wanted Swann to use his psychic abilities to visit another location in outer space, the moon. Swann didn't understand. As far as he knew, the moon was a gray and lifeless rock. Plus, hadn't we already sent astronauts there? Axelrod told him that he wanted Swann to look at the dark side of the moon, the part that always faces away from Earth. The following morning, Swann sat with Axelrod and he began to astrally project his consciousness to the moon. At first, Swann saw pretty much what you'd expect of the lunar surface, nothing but moon dust and craters for as far as the eye could see. But then Swann began to think maybe he had done something wrong, and that he was actually viewing a location on Earth. That's because even though the moon should have had no atmosphere, he said that he could see a crater containing a glowing green haze. But that didn't make any sense, because for there to be any sort of mist, there had to be an atmosphere. He told Axelrod he thought he'd made a mistake, but Axelrod encouraged him to keep looking. Swann was confused. He saw what appeared to be tractor treads in the lunar soil, and beyond those, he could see lights in the distance. He asked Axelrod if the Russians had built a base on the moon, but Mr. Axelrod did not respond. As Ingo Swann continued to remote view the lunar surface, he saw more signs of life. It soon dawned on him that what he was looking at wasn't anything built by the Russians, or by anyone else here on Earth for that matter. He realized that Axelrod must have already known these alien beings were there, but if that was the case, then what did he need Swann for? He asked Axelrod about this, but the man remained frustratingly non-committal with his answers. Swann asked Axelrod why couldn't they just send another manned mission to the moon? The only reason Ingo Swann could think why astronauts had never gone back to the moon was because the aliens didn't want them there. "They're not friendly, are they?" he asked Axelrod. The man simply smiled, but did not answer. Swann had a lot to think about that night as he went to sleep. The following morning, he began another remote viewing session. This time, he further explored the glowing green crater. Inside was what looked like some sort of airbase, complete with hangars, bridges, and roads. There were perfectly round holes that appeared to have been dug by some sort of drilling equipment. There was a large obelisk that reminded him of the Washington Monument, and several dome-shaped structures with large windows. Swann got close to one of these domed windows and looked inside. He saw several humanoid creatures working. They all looked busy, and at first, they didn't notice him. But then, one after another, They began looking up, directly at him. He told Mr. Axelrod that they could see him. Axelrod calmly but urgently told Swann that it was time to end the session. Swann told Axelrod that some of the beings had begun pointing at him. Axelrod told him again to get out of there, right now. When Ingo Swann finally broke away from remote viewing the moon, he looked at Axelrod and said, "You knew they were psychic, didn't you?" Axelrod told Swann that the experiment was over. Axelrod paid Ingo Swann for his time and returned him to his New York apartment. But this wasn't the last time Ingo Swann would ever see the mysterious Mr. Axelrod. About 6 months later, Swann was shopping in a grocery store when he spotted one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen in his life. She was a gorgeous brunette wearing high heels, a skimpy halter top, and short shorts. At first, Swann thought he was just incredibly turned on by the sight of her. But then he began to get a creepy feeling about her. There was something strange about this woman, something that made him think that she wasn't quite human. Swann began to think that she was an alien. His suspicions were further confirmed a few moments later when he spotted one of the twins in the grocery store, watching the two of them. Swann suddenly had a psychic vision in his mind of a white card that said, "Please do not speak, and please act normal." A few moments later, Swann spotted the other twins standing nearby. He began to feel as if he was in danger, so he turned and fled the store. That night, Swann received another phone call. This one instructed him to fly to New York and await contact in Grand Central Station. When he got to Grand Central, he spotted one of the twins standing near a bank of payphones. He gestured for Swann to come closer. That was when one of the phones rang. It was Mr. Axelrod. He asked Swann to tell him about the encounter with the mystery woman. Swann told him everything that happened. Axelrod sounded suspicious. Swann said he was confused and a little frightened by the incident. Axelrod said he was right to be afraid and that the woman was very dangerous. He told Swann that if he ever saw her again, he should turn and run away. Then Axelrod asked Swann how his success rate was with his remote viewing. Swann said he was accurate nearly 65% of the time. Axelrod told him to keep working on it, and that when he finally did reach 65%, to leave him a message. Axelrod said that when he was ready, he should write the number 65 on a note and leave it on his desk. After that, Axelrod hung up. Ingo Swann didn't hear from Mr. Axelrod again for another year. But when he finally reached 65% accuracy, he followed Axelrod's instructions. He wrote the number 65 on a piece of paper and placed it on his desk. Then he left for the night, locking the door behind him. The only way in was with an access code that no one but Ingo Swann knew, or so he thought. The following morning, when Swann returned to the office, the note was gone. In its place was a light dusting of powder on the desk surface. And in that powder, someone had written 2 words, "Expect contact." Later that day, Swann was on his way to the university cafeteria when Mr. Axelrod approached him. He asked Swann if he could get away for a few days. He had something he wanted to show him. When Swann asked Axelrod where they were going, Axelrod asked him if he wanted to see a UFO. Axelrod and the twins arranged for Swann to accompany them on a private plane. Swann didn't know exactly where they went, but he had a sense that they were somewhere in Alaska. By the time the plane landed, it was late at night. After they were on the ground, the 4 men got into an unmarked van. Swann was given a thermal jumpsuit to wear. He was told to remove everything metal on him. Axelrod fretted that Swann had metal fillings in his teeth, but there was nothing they could do about that. They drove for 2 more hours along winding roads through the wilderness. They eventually came to a stop somewhere in a pine forest. Axelrod told him from that moment on, it was of the utmost importance that they remain as quiet as possible. They got out of the van and hiked for another 45 minutes through the woods. The terrain was difficult and the group remained silent during the entire hike. The twins led the way using night vision goggles to guide them through the dark. They eventually reached the edge of a lake. Swann asked Axelrod, "What now?" Axelrod whispered that now they wait and observe. They needed to remain as quiet and still as possible. They could detect not only sound, but heat and motion as well. Swann mouthed the word, "They?" But Axelrod shushed him with a finger to his lips. A few minutes later, the show began. The first thing Swann saw was a thick fog rolling slowly in across the lake. But from within that mist, Swann began to see something glowing with an electric blue light that quickly turned purple. The fog grew thicker, and then Swann stood there stunned as a triangular-shaped craft rose up out of the mist. It was at least 90 feet wide, and it emitted a pulsating hum. The ship began shooting out beams of light that struck various spots along the shore. As the craft grew closer, one of the twins whispered that they needed to move. Suddenly, one of those beams of light struck the ground right where the men had been standing only seconds before. This was followed by a loud electric crackling noise. Swann felt frozen in place. One of the twins had to physically drag him away. As they fled the area, the last thing Swann saw behind them was the ship sucking up water from the lake below. He described it as looking like a waterfall in reverse. The twins led Swann and Axelrod back through the forest into the unmarked van. By the time they reached the airport, the sun was just coming up over the horizon. Swann told Axelrod that he finally knew what the aliens were doing. Axelrod told him to go on. Swann said he thought that the alien ship they just saw was some sort of unmanned drone, and that it was resupplying itself by sucking up the water. He told Axelrod that the aliens were mining the moon, and that they had come down to Earth for water. Axelrod neither confirmed nor denied any of this. He simply thanked Swann for his time and shook his hand. He told Swann he would be flying back to New York without them. Swann never saw Mr. Axelrod or the twins again. Ingo Swann kept his word, and he never said or wrote anything about his encounters with Mr. Axelrod or about aliens on the moon for another 10 years. He eventually published his story in his book, Penetration. Now, the first question you should ask is, any of this true? We know for a fact that Ingo Swann was one of the key players in Project Stargate. The CIA has released thousands of pages of files about their psychic spy program, and Ingo Swann's name is in a lot of them. But the stories about Ingo Swann remote viewing the moon and about Mr. Axelrod don't actually come from those declassified documents. The main evidence we have that any of it happened just as Ingo Swann described is his word. You have to admit, a lot of Swann's story sounds pretty unbelievable. Not just for the obvious reasons, but there are a lot of little things that don't completely add up either. Let's think about this for a minute. If Mr. Axelrod knew exactly where and when a UFO would appear over Alaska, then why did the four of them need to go there in person? Couldn't he have simply given Swann the coordinates and had him remote view the location? There's also the story of the alleged alien woman in the grocery store. Assuming Swann actually saw a beautiful woman in the grocery store as he described, there's no evidence to show that she was anything other than a sexy woman in a skimpy outfit. The fact that the twins just happened to show up at the same time does seem to indicate that there was something more to the woman than meets the eye, though. But at the same time, there's nothing in Swann's own account that proves that she was anything other than human. She could have just as easily been a Russian spy. In fact, that's a lot more plausible than her being an alien robot. As for the big part of the story, well, there have been rumors about aliens on the moon that date back to Neil Armstrong's lunar landing. There's even a long-standing rumor that claims when the lunar lander first touched down, Armstrong switched over to a confidential medical radio channel to inform NASA that he could see a row of spaceships lined up along the horizon. Over the years, dozens of photos have been released by NASA of the lunar surface that show anomalies that look like buildings and other man-made structures. But all these photos are grainy and distant, and NASA has always contested that these things are just tricks of light and shadow. The last Apollo mission to the moon was Apollo 17 in 1972. There were supposed to be 3 others after that, but NASA claimed they scrubbed these missions due to rising costs and lack of public interest. But what if there was another reason we never went back to the moon? At the same time, there have been several other unmanned missions to the moon since then. In 2019, the Chinese Chang'e space probe touched down on the dark side of the moon. In 2024, that probe returned to Earth with the first samples taken from the far side of the moon. The one thing the probe didn't find, though, was proof of aliens living there. The CIA's official report on the Stargate program stated that the program was shut down because the psychics they employed never produced any tangible results. But there are still a lot of people to this day who believe that Ingo Swann was the real deal. For example, his predictions about Jupiter proved to be spot on. At the same time, Swann himself admitted that he got things wrong sometimes. But it's the amount of times that Ingo Swann got things right that really makes you stop and wonder if any of his wildest predictions could be true as well. Ingo Swann died in 2013, and right to the end, he insisted that he believed aliens really were mining the moon. Over the next few years, several countries including China, Russia, South Korea, India, and the United States all plan on sending manned missions to the moon. Maybe one day soon, man will walk on the lunar surface once again, and we'll finally find out if Ingo Swann was right. This episode was just the tip of the iceberg about the US government's psychic spy program, so if you want to hear more, leave me a comment below. In the meantime, if you want to hear even more about the way the Stargate program may tie into the Gifted and Talented Education Program, or GATE program, then click the video on the screen right now. Thanks again for watching.